Hello, this is Cho of the Shiny Colors Discord. Welcome to another episode of the Shiny Review. Today we've got two new cards to talk about, the new produced SSRs for Kaho and Madoka as part of ParaColle Collection. Remember that ParaColle Collection is technically limited. These cards only appear in future ParaColle Collection banners, and once this banner is over, they'll be gone until the next one, in which, when they come back, they will be at a much lower pull rate than what they are now. So if you want to guarantee yourself a copy of either Kaho or Madoka, now is really your best chance to do so. With that all said, let's talk first about Kaho. Round 3 of ParaColle begins with Kaho jumping ahead 2 years to put her where Asahi is in our timeline. She's a single-target dance unit who focuses on drastically lowering her attention, while also doing a little bit of gambling to buff each member of her unit's appeal strength by a small amount for several turns. Her initial appeal picks 2 buffs, while her final appeal picks 3. This culminates in her 4-star passive, which is both the strongest and most frustrating passive currently printed. Now look, as a Kaho P, I don't want to have to say it, but this Kaho is a little off-kilter. She doesn't synergize with most Dance Hokuto cards, She doesn't synergize with most of the Dance Hokuto cards right now, and is in fact anti-synergy with their best damage dealer in Natsuha 6. She's also doubled down on rolling the dice for buffs, but in a way that almost feels worse than Duet or Double Duet. Ignoring all this, she enables her max strength memory appeal just by herself, which hits extremely hard. It also helps that because she is a ParaColle Collection unit, it means that you can technically not have to run her as a center and still reap the benefits of a charge appeal on somebody else on your team. It's kind of a conflicting card. Her roles are center, buffer, and attention down, and I moderately recommend pulling for this Kaho. Now, if you have all the pieces that we'll go over later in the synergy section, this card is absolutely worth picking up for Dance Hokuto specifically, but if you're just looking for a generic dance card, this isn't really going to do a whole lot for you. Kaho's initial appeal has a lot going on, so let's try to break it down first. Initially, it's a Dance 4.0 appeal that reduces your attention by 500% for 5 turns. Then it applies 2 random effects of the 5 below. It can be a Kaho appeal buff of 0.1 for 5 turns, or it can be the same effect for Chiyoko, Rinzai, Juri, or Natsuha. All of these buffs last for 5 turns, and you get 2 of these 5. The plus appeal, which requires 4 or more Hokuto members in your skill history, gives you a Kaho buff in addition to the 2 random buffs for 5 turns. So that means you could roll Kaho, Chiyoko, and then plus into Kaho, or you could get Chiyoko and Juri and then plus into Kaho, so you have 3 out of the 5 instead of just 2. The 4-star version of this appeal just really improves the appeal itself. It becomes a Dance 5.0, keeps the same attention 500% down for 5 turns buff, but now you get 3 of the effects instead of just 2. The plus appeal is the same, guaranteeing you a Kaho buff. So ideally, you would want to see something like Chiyoko, Juri, Rinzai, and then Kaho from the plus appeal, so that way you only need Natsuha from the other. For her passives, her 1-star passive is a Dance 60% up if it's turned 2 or earlier and has a 35% chance to activate once. Her 2-star passive is a Dance 110% up if you are running the full Hokuto lineup, which has a 30% chance to activate twice. This comes with a Dance 100 uncap. Her 3-star uncap is a Dance plus 100, and at 4 stars, she gets her Rainbow passive alongside a Dance plus 150 uncap. Said Rainbow passive is a Dance 300% up that requires 1 of each of the Hokuto buffs previously mentioned. So this means you need at least 1 Kaho, 1 Juri, 1 Rinzai, 1 Chiyoko, and 1 Natsuha. If you have all 5, this passive can activate, which has a 100% activation rate twice, but is limited to once per turn. As for her memory appeal, when maxed out, it's a Dance 2.0 that follows up the initial appeal with another Dance 2.0 that scales based on how low your attention is. This links into a Dance Maximum 3.0 that scales based on how low your attention is, and the charge appeal starts out at a Dance 1.0 at level 1, working its way up to a Dance 2.5 at level 5. Now, we've talked about how charge appeal works in previous reviews, but the short and sweet is that the levels are simultaneously locked behind memory level and the number of copies merged. That means that even if you had this Kaho at max memory, if she's only at 1 star, it's capped out at level 2. So if you want the level 5, you have to get all 5 copies of Kaho and get her to memory level 5. Kaho is one of the very few triple hit memory appeals and adds 1 more through her charge, all with 1 attribute of damage. If you ignore the buffs that you potentially would get from her appeals that would buff her own appeal strength, this is at least a Dance 9.5 if you factor in everything, which is kind of crazy, all things considered. Now, just like with Twilight's collection, ParaColle collection does not feature a Hazuki system from the get-go, meaning that any dupes you get will either be really expensive or really rare. Now, deciding how many dupes are okay or not depends entirely on how much you value the charge appeal more than anything. Now, unfortunately, there's another caveat here, which is that all of Kaho's kit revolves around her 4-star passive. Both of the appeals are necessary in order to make this happen because there are no other Hokuto cards that do what need to be done in order to activate this passive. So, because of that, you kind of have to fully commit to the bit if you want to make this Kaho as strong as possible, since there is no alternative. So be very mindful about your investment with this card, as the future is kind of uncertain. If we get more cards that function like this Kaho and make the load a lot lighter on this card specifically, then this card's value goes up by a lot. But if we don't really get anything to help out this card, then things get a little rough. Now, for the support recommendations, of course the MVP here is ParaColle Natsuha, but we've got a couple other cards here to talk about. The combination of a small Hokuto package for dance alongside the 2 key pieces to the Austromeria dance lineup go a pretty long way for builds like this. You get the masteries along with really easy stat growth. MV Asahi has some natural synergy thanks to the fact that her passive scales with Juri. As long as you have Juri on the team, one of her passives is live, and thankfully, Juri is always going to be on the team, which makes her an easier inclusion than her ParaColle counterpart, though that card is still a very good option as well. Now, Daikichi is a card that you generally want to consider for dance builds anyway, though I stand by the feeling that Daikichi is a little less helpful for Hokuto, thanks to how their playstyle has shifted to being kind of strict and really fast-paced, meaning that a card like this, where they want to slow down the game and be a lot more defensive, doesn't really play to the strengths of Hokuto and make things a little more complicated. Now, Bridal Madoka is a solid option to include thanks to her masteries that aren't really dependent on Knock Chill. This leads to some really high swinging stat growth thanks to things like Excellent Boost and Room Mastery. This means that it's way easier for you to potentially have some high level rooms in step, or some really crazy stat gains thanks to Excellent Boost. There's a lot of good ways to utilize this card alongside a lot of the great cards already on Showcase here. Now for some synergy suggestions. Natsuha 10, aka My Songs Collection Natsuha, while a bit weaker than Natsuha 6, is the only Natsuha that doesn't immediately crumble when using Kaho's appeals. Her memory appeal is slightly weaker than Kaho's, but it does make it an okay option if you want to utilize the charge appeal effect, and her 2-star passive does grant memory gauge, which can be very helpful, since this team has historically kind of had some problems with memory gauge gain. I've seen builds already utilizing step passives exclusive to the mode that give you memory gauge in order to compensate for this, so Natsuha can help fuel that. If you don't feel like playing around Kaho's appeal and want to take things in a slightly riskier approach, you could focus on an attention build to let Natsuha attack early if you're using Natsuha 6, and then try to lower your attention with new Kaho later. Moving on, we have My Songs Collection Rinze, who's an aggressive AoE unit, which this version of Hokuto, if you aren't running Natsuha 6, lacks for the dance position. She does provide memory gauge as well with her 1-star passive. That's something, again, the team lacks outright. You could choose to run Rinze 7 as a leader for an alternative if you don't care about the AoE and just want more memory gauge. Lastly, Juri 10 is here to provide double duet, allowing us to get to the plus appeal on Kaho as well as most of the passives for a lot of these stronger Hokuto cards. She's a double-edged sword for your double-edged team. She provides a solid passive boost as well, while also setting up your memory appeal and doesn't clash with Kaho's kit. Also notably, Juri has a very strong memory appeal, meaning that she does benefit from the charge appeal from Kaho. If you decide to not run Kaho as your center, Juri is, so far, the most decided upon center for the team if you opt to go that route. Unfortunately, we don't have a Choco to really suggest right now either. A lot of us are surmising that Choco is going to get a card this year that will probably synergize with this Kaho better, since Choco has been in kind of a weird limbo state in regards to her card quality, so we could see another card that synergizes with this Kaho in the future, but we just gotta hold out and see. Now onto the grades. As a center, I think Kaho is a really easy double S. As mentioned earlier, the real strength of PC Kaho is the fact that off a single appeal of hers, the memory appeal is immediately a full power. With enough charge, swinging at the judge with 4 appeals is an obscene amount of damage, given that each hit is receiving buffs over one big singular attack getting all the buffs. Of course, then, there's also the fact that she can buff her own appeals technically by 0.1 with each buff that she gets from her own appeals, which makes her memory appeal that much stronger. While we can't say for certain if she'll be their best center going forward, she's certainly a very powerful one at present if you don't have a lot of the other options that we mentioned earlier. As a unit, this is where it gets tricky. And it mostly stems from the fact that she's a kind of new take on their playstyle. It's hard to gauge exactly how good or bad this is going to be in the future. Now, if you just look at it at a vacuum, she has semi-generic dance appeals that give you a lot of attention down, which is really cool, but buffs that are not very powerful, but do last a while. And really, the other problem is that because she's a ParaColle collection card that focuses on charge, she doesn't have any memory gauge boosting either through her appeals or her passives to add to consistency. Now, she does hide the strongest passive in the game behind an extremely strict requirement and provides very little as a unit unless the stars really align. You are kind of hoping that both of her appeals just hit everybody in the correct way in order to access that 300% passive. There are totally going to be turns where you use both appeals and just miss out by one character, and now you're kind of stuck without any way to get to that 300% passive. She is absolutely a high potential unit, in fact, probably the epitome of high potential right now. I would say if you're somebody that is really curious about the future of Dance Hokuda, you would pick up this card. Otherwise, you're probably okay to hold. Next up then we have Madoka. So as an aside, I've seen some people prefer translating her card title as Junction with a K as opposed to the C, which isn't necessarily a dig at the story or at Madoka. Apparently there's some thematic reason as to why this would be potentially more appropriate, but I don't have the card and I can't really attempt to read it right now, so just take my word for it. The Madoka Ps I've heard say that that seems correct. 3 years later, Madoka calls back to their first SSR setup, which feels very appropriate. She's an AoE vocal unit who focuses on evasion and buffing her vocal with every successful dodge. She actively wants to stack as many evasion buffs as possible, not just for the chance to dodge, but to enable her plus appeal and 4-star passive. Generally speaking, Madoka is pretty good. Her buffs have a generous uptime, and her kit is well packed in enough to where all the moving pieces are synced up. Her appeal grants attention with the plus effect, paired with her 2-star passive granting some evasion, so you're more likely to be hit in the first place to dodge, which then grants you vocal buffs to make your next appeal stronger and set up the rest of your team. Her memory appeal is incredibly strong, making her a great all-rounder unit for vocal knockchill. Her roles are center, attack all, buffer, attention up, and evasion up, and I moderately to highly recommend pulling for this Madoka. Madoka's initial appeal is the vocal 3.5 to all judges. It raises your vocal by 100% for 4 turns per successful dodge. You have 2 turns to get up to 3 separate dodges, meaning that this can get you up to a vocal 300% buff. This also grants you 1 mulligan on use. The plus appeal, which requires 2 or more active evasion up buffs, grants you an attention 50% buff for 3 turns. The 4-star version of this appeal is a vocal 4.5 to all judges that raises your vocal by 120% for 4 turns per successful dodge, which has 3 turns to go up to 3 times, meaning it's a vocal 360% buff at max. This grants 1 mulligan, and the plus appeal, which requires again 2 or more active evasion up buffs, an attention 50% buff for 3 turns. Her 1-star passive is a vocal 60% up and attention 50% up that requires it to be turned 2 or earlier. This has a 35% chance to activate once. Her 2-star passive is a vocal 100% up and evasion 30% up that requires the full knockchill lineup. This has a 30% chance to activate 3 times, and this comes with a vocal 100 uncap. Her 3-star uncap is vocal 100, and her 4-star uncap is a vocal 150 alongside her rainbow passive. Said rainbow passive is a vocal 150% up and attention 50% up as long as you have 2 or more active evasion up buffs. This has a 30% chance to activate twice and is limited to once per turn. Her memory appeal when maxed out is a vocal 3.0 that links into a vocal maximum 3.5 that scales based on how high your reaction is. The charge appeal is a vocal 1 to 2.5 depending on the level. This is effectively the same memory appeal as ParaColle Collection Hinata, except now vocal instead of visual, which should mean that future knockchill cards will be this strong as well. A lot of what I said then still stands. You can choose to either run Madoka as a center and make the most of it, or a maxed Madoka can provide the charge to somebody else. 2-star is kind of the safest stopping point for Madoka, since now we're at that point. She gains access to a handy evasion passive, but doesn't compromise in her game plan. While maxing her out does give you the most bang for your buck with the stronger appeal and the stronger vocal buff, it's not really mandatory if you intend to use her as your center. since ideally you're not looking to use her appeal, you're just trying to get the memory appeal out and then go from there. She's able to pivot to whatever role you need her for in this way, making her a very flexible pick no matter the number of copies that you decide to pull for. For the support recommendations, the MVP is ParaColle Hinata. Vocal Good Stuff takes a slight shift here, allowing some Nocchill options to bleed into the usual foray. ParaColle Hinata, when paired up with this Toru, help provide the team with much-needed evasion, even if it's not necessarily built into Madoka specifically. They both have appeals that make the most sense if you can't fill out Madoka's appeal lineup, so they're great options to consider if you don't have Madoka at 4 stars. MV Kaho, when paired up with TC Jury, help generate a lot of stamina and are consistent with their vocal stay masteries. It also helps that because Nocchill have the extra slot available on their team, you can opt to run a Kaho, Fuyuko, or Mei in one of those spots to take advantage of Kaho's passives. Most teams I've seen trying to utilize this will use Fuyuko, as she is the one that usually has the highest point bonus. Cards like Sakuya and Mamimi are no-brainers and carryovers from the usual Good Stuff builds, with expected synergy and easy sets of kits to work with. Meg Kichi, if you need to slow things down, is great, and of course on brand for the team and the attribute. For the synergy suggestions, My Songs Collection Toru continues to be a great option for Nocchill, thanks in part to having a respectable memory appeal, along with her change appeals to help fuel the conditions for Madoka's stronger passives and buffs. She's a great pick overall for basically any Nocchill team right now, but especially for vocal. Hinata 6 provides memory gauge if Toru and Koito are already in rotation, and is another source of evasion to get Madoka moving. Her memory appeal is on the weaker end, making her less of a target for the center bonus or the charge appeal, but is still a worthwhile card to consider. Koito 5 provides an ample amount of evasion alongside mulligans and decent bonuses to your evasion and attention when she appeals. She provides a good blend of benefits both actively and passively, which adds to her flexibility on the team. For the grades, I think Madoka earns, just like Hinata, an S+ to SS-. Madoka's memory appeal is just as strong as Hinata's, making her an entirely acceptable option here if you're lacking in duplicates. That said, those duplicates do add to your overall damage thanks to charge, meaning she'll only get better as you pull more copies of her. It is also worth mentioning, too, that because her memory appeal scales off of evasion up, it's a little bit harder to necessarily get the required evasion to reach the max damage, which is why the minus is even there in the first place, and why I would say it kind of teeters between the two rather than being blatantly a strong memory appeal. If we had, or rather the team had more access to more evasion, this could be more consistent for you than it would be for somebody else, which is where the fluctuation kind of occurs. As a unit, B+ to S+. In a not-so-surprising turn of events, my opinion on Madoka is not too dissimilar to PC Hinata. She has a lot of good things going for her when you consider her full kit as being a complete package. Vocal is also in a great position right now with the amount of support offered, allowing the unit to thrive. Her biggest downfall is the lack of memory gauge generation, and the fact that she still has to get hit in order to proc the evasion bonuses to get her vocal buffs. This has always been kind of the problem with Nocchill, is that as long as teams utilize attention buffs, it's harder for them to necessarily garner all the attention with lower attention bonuses. Because the team is so dependent on getting hit in order to get those bonuses, there are a lot of times where, even in good runs, if they aren't hit enough, they don't have enough buffs to really feel that impactful, while other runs will just be way more explosive because they just happen to get hit more often. You'll have to get creative with your builds to draw out her potential, but I think this card absolutely feels real good and should slot into a lot of teams very comfortably, especially with Nocchill getting more and more support as we go. So, that will do it for the video today. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. Next time we'll be talking about the upcoming banner, which is going to be a permanent SSR for Fuyuko. Let's see how that card shakes out in the current state of the game. Till then, I've been Cho, thank you for watching, have a wonderful rest of your day.